What's up, football fans? Welcome to the SumerSports Show. Lindsay Rhodes with Sam Bruchhaus, ready to walk you through all of the fun things that took place yesterday on this Sunday of Week 16. Just 2 weeks left, and things are getting even more clear in terms of the playoff hunt. We lost a lot of teams yesterday to just make those teams that we need to talk about in terms of the playoff hunt. It's a smaller sample from here on out, Sam.
Certainly. There was a lot of interesting stuff, and I think we really got to focus in because, as you said, some of those games were not the best, but there was good things happening in them. So they were fun to watch if you're watching Red Zone or the 4-Box on YouTube TV, but you were able to really focus in on the Eagles and the Commanders, and you were really able to focus in on Michael Penix, putting his team back in a position where they're in the NFC South. And so you were able to keep an eye on the interesting stuff, but you were really able to focus in on what mattered, and that's why I think it was a really exciting weekend altogether.
Yeah, and and then there was the Colts Titans game with 7 completed passes in a win for the Indianapolis Colts, who are still alive. Of all the teams that have been eliminated, the Indianapolis Colts, who have felt largely irrelevant, I think, for the majority of the year, they are actually still in the mix in the AFC at 7-8. That feels a little bit like it doesn't feel realistic, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But lacking the word choice here. You've got Indy, you've got Miami, and you've got Cincy all sitting at 7-8 as the 3 teams on the outside looking in with a shot to get in, but a couple of games back of everybody else. So, And then on the NFC side, we've got Tampa now on the outside looking in. We talked last week on the show prior to them moving to Michael Penix, called it. You were able to put your finger on the fact that that was something that should be on our radar and why it should be on our radar and why it was a good move for the Falcons. And it immediately paid off for them in the form of a win and, I think, additional hope.
Certainly. Penix coming in changed the whole offense, which we had talked about deeply. We thought was going to happen. We thought it was going to be more of, let's run it and then chunk it deep offense. It opened the whole playbook up. It was really quite shocking. Sean Syed did a great job of covering it on his Monday morning mashup on SumerSports.com live right now. But what was most interesting to me is week 1, we really hammered the Falcons because we were like, this isn't just jiving with what Kirk Cousins does, period. Like, the play calling is not there. It was, and you chalked it up to a first-time play caller, a first-time offensive coordinator even, and had to think to yourself, maybe this will get better. But it seems as if the issue was truly just Kirk Cousins because the timing routes were there. The ADOT was a little under average, but I think we can chalk that up a little bit to them really racing ahead of the Giants. Will caveat all of this with it was basically a glorified preseason game. Like, the Giants didn't look good. They couldn't get anything together. There were 2 pick sixes. It was a mess from them. But everything was there. The playbook was open. A high target game for both Drake London and for Darnell Mooney. Even the pick itself was a great throw to Kyle Pitts with the kind of fluky ball goes up in the air after he tries to tuck. And it was just everything we wanted to see. I think they're really, really dangerous now, especially if the defense can kind of follow up. I think they're really dangerous, particularly on offense.
Yeah, I mean, so now they're tied with Tampa Bay, just in terms of the standings. They have the same record, but they also have 2 wins against them in hand.
Right.
Their schedule moving forward is definitely tougher than the one that the Bucs will be facing. The Bucs have the Panthers at home and then the Saints at home in the final 2 weeks of the season, whereas the Falcons have to go to Washington and face Jaden Daniels and the Commanders, which is a team I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about because of that Eagles game and the implications there. And then they've got the Panthers at home in week 17. Penix, I think it can't be understated how much he, to your point, did change things for the offense and how impressive that was for a first showing in the NFL. Like, so it is hard to, as you astutely pointed out, really get a grasp of how to allocate credit and how good the good actually was because you're going up against a Giants team that is just terrible across the board, right? Like, at this point in the season, and one could argue it benefits them to be terrible moving forward in terms of draft positioning. But that said, Penix, 9th in EPA per dropback of the week, 12th in completion percentage over expectation. He had the 8th highest yards per attempt of the week, 7.5 passing. He faced the highest pressure rate of the week, 48.3%, but did not take a single sack.
That's the difference.
Huge. Got the ball out fast. He had the second quickest time to throw of the week. Like, that's really impressive for a rookie. I mean, we can't even glaze over that. You're in the pocket for the first time. We talk about rookies and how everything is sped up. And the fact that he was able to, I mean, and that might be part of the strategy there, that they just identified, like, here's what you're going to do. We're going to simplify it. You're going to get the ball out. But he was under pressure at the rate that he was and still got the ball out really fast and completed every pass that he attempted to the middle of the field. For the people who talked about that not being his strength coming into his career in the NFL in terms of draft prep, but also Kirk Cousins to the middle of the field in the last few weeks. It's been kind of a like middle intermediate. That's been a weakness of his. And so Penix steps in and they get a boost. His total EPA on the week was 8.1. Cousins has only surpassed that number in a game 2 times this year. And I do think it's interesting, and I want to get your thoughts on this. It feels fluky, right? But looking at a passing chart, he was far more successful, Penix was, throwing to the right side. 6 of his 9 incompletions came to the left. And obviously on the right, one of the incompletions that wasn't his fault, thanks to Pitts, who just decided to like lateral it to the other team. But I digress. I thought that Penix looked really, really good.
I totally agree. And we have Asa who's commenting in sack avoidance for the win. I think if you can highlight and really boil down what the coaches probably thought coming into this game, if one thing could be different from what Kirk Cousins was doing, it was sack avoidance. That has absolutely killed them all year. And Kirk Cousins just has not been mobile at all.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the difference is typically Penix is not going to be the mobile Jaden Daniels type, Caleb Williams type, who's going to scramble around and try to make a play. He's just going to get rid of the ball. But they avoided bad plays. We've seen Bo Nix be able to have a successful team even when he is not successful by avoiding those sacks all year. And I think you get 14, 15, 16 weeks through the year, you know that Drake London's good. You know that Darnell Mooney is good. You know you can kind of run the ball behind that offensive line with Bijan and Algier. And you're just like, I'm sick of getting sacked all the time. And I think he completely did his job there, as you mentioned, despite facing pressure. And I think he was able to push the ball down the field. With regards to the direction, I'm interested in the matchup. I'd have to dive deeper into the film for that. And also Drake London did, I think, have a minor injury in this game where he missed kind of the second half of the game. But nonetheless, it's just like the ability to get the ball in the hands of or at least in the zone of the wide receivers where it needs to be, the ability to open up the playbook primarily for Bijan. I think that was kind of the big difference. They were able to get in those pistol sets that they want to get into and run the ball with the threat of, the bootleg, with the threat of a timing throw on the backside, and particularly since he's left-handed, with the threat of kind of a different attack than most defenses are used to seeing. And it just played out beautifully in a game that they were supposed to win against the Giants. Now they go face the Commanders. It's going to be a whole different beast.
Totally.
But I'm juiced to see that matchup. I think it's going to be one of the most fascinating games of the year.
Yeah, and I think at the very least, we feel more optimism about the fact that they could potentially, we don't know what they're going to be. We don't know. There's so many unanswered questions about the Falcons coming off of that game for all of the reasons that we've talked about. And so that's kind of a fun element of like a little bit of inserted chaos to this whole stretch run and then playoff picture, because, this is the time of year where we're like, who do you not want to play? Who is the dark horse team? Like, I don't know what the Falcons are. I don't know what they're going to do against, whoever they get matched up against in the first round, if it's them and not Tampa Bay. I don't know. And looking at zooming out and trying to get an idea of that, looking at the defensive performance too. Obviously Penix isn't, but now that they have that element at quarterback, and then maybe Mooney is a little bit more unlocked on some of the deep balls, and hopefully Drake is healthy and they're able to be like full strength down the stretch. Then you look at the defense and what can the defense do? The defense had, again, against the Giants, but the fastest get off time of the week, sent pressure fast. And it came frequently. They had the second highest pressure rate of the week, second to the Giants, which I already mentioned. They were number 1 in EPA per pass against. That's certainly partially what the Giants were offering up offensively. But I think that the Falcons become kind of an interesting question mark as we try and figure out what we're looking at for the playoffs.
I think the latent factor here is their defensive line. They went and made the move for Judon, who had a big play, but I think that was a little bit more on the quarterback than on Judon himself on that one. But you have Jesse Bates and you have AJ Terrell, and that is who you really want to lean on in coverage. And I think that's going to be the absolute name of the game against the Commanders coming up this week. If they're able to play well on the screens, be able to tackle well, even getting involved with the linebackers, guys like Caden Ellis. If they're able to tackle well on the perimeter and stop the big plays that kind of killed the Eagles, the big throws that Jane Daniels was able to make down the field, I think they have a shot in this game. I think I struggle to trust the Falcons defense just because of the age on that on that defensive front right now. But the players are there. And when the players are there and you have substantially more help from your offense,
right,
I can attest it totally changes the calculus. And we've seen that across the league with certain teams this year.
Now, the bad news for either of the NFC South teams that do get into the postseason is that they are going to play, it looks like, the other team from the NFC North. And so you've got Detroit sitting in the 1 seed right now, but with the same record as Minnesota. And so whether it's Atlanta versus Minnesota in the first round, or Tampa Bay, or if it's Detroit that falls to 5 for whatever reason, then that's a really tough matchup. Do either of those two teams strike you as a team that is better suited to have success in that first round matchup?
It's ironic, but I think Tampa is probably a little better suited just because we've seen the offense win all year.
Right.
Moreover, we've seen the offense run the ball all year. And obviously you have Bijan, you have guys like Chris Lindstrom up front, but I am just a little bit more willing to say that I'll trust Baker and Mike Evans and Tristan Wirfs, who seem to have a tweaked ankle in the game, and Gedeke and that front that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have right now, particularly given they have options at the running back position. We saw Rachaad White have an awful fumble last evening, but Bucky Irving played well. They kind of have to go away with him because it doesn't seem like he's a true pass blocker yet. And, if you go up against the Vikings, that's a major, major problem. If you're going to have to take your best running back out of the game when you have to pass block, because Buffalo is going to take advantage of that. But I'm leaning the Bucs just because I have a little bit more consistency in that offense that I know I can fall back on. That being said, if we see a Falcons team that beats a Commanders defense that does have Marshawn Lattimore, who was competing, if not winning all the time against A.J. Brown, and Mikey Sanders still, who had a pretty good game as well, and some of the players, veteran players they have on in the linebacking core. If we see them just cook that defense, I might change my answer. So this is kind of like a 75-25 answer right here towards the Bucs, but I think there's big potential for the Falcons to move into a spot where it's like, I don't want to play them just because they're talent.
Well, and at the very least, let's say that they don't go to the postseason and it ends up being Tampa Bay for whatever reason, or they go to the postseason and they lose in the first round. Regardless, they made the right choice at this point, right? To move to Penix, that feels like that has already been rewarded. And they also now are getting him some reps. So even if this season is a wash, because nobody's expecting them to make a Super Bowl run. I mean, anything's possible, I guess, if you get into the dance. But you are getting a head start on next year. And you are getting an idea of what you have in Michael Penix, and that is somebody that might actually be good. It's wild to look at the rookie quarterbacks and to think, in as many cases as there are, that they all might have swung and hit.
Certainly.
because the one who's probably played the poorest, and forgive me, please point out if I'm forgetting somebody, is probably Caleb.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
but it feels situational to a degree, and I'm confident that he will at least be better. If we get a different coaching staff in there and there's a little bit more stability in the environment. But Drake May looks like a hit. They look like they got their quarterback. Bo Nix has been a little bit like this, I guess. But it feels like that's probably going to work with Sean Payton to a degree. Certainly Jaden Daniels. And we might as well get to that game, I suppose, now, because I think that he probably wrapped up the offensive rookie of the year in that game against Philadelphia. That feels like a weird place to start with regards to that game, because there's so many impactful things that we need to flush out from that Philly-Washington game. But do you think that there's any doubt in your mind that Jaden Daniels is the offensive rookie of the year at this point?
There's no doubt in my mind, and I've been on the train all year that nobody is performing as well as Jaden. Just the stat line is nuts. 24 for 39, 258 yards, 5 touchdowns passing. He did have the 2 picks, both of which were critically bad, but he kept the Commanders in the game with his legs. 9 attempts for 81 yards rushing with 2 major conversions. I think that I'm at the point where I think that the Commanders could have had a much less successful, quote, rebuild, particularly on the offensive line and on the defense, and they still would be in a very similar position, even if they were at 500, because he just keeps you in the game, Lindsay. It's really quite nuts. On the flip side, just tagging back to our last conversation, it is interesting to think of if Penix leads the Falcons into 3 straight wins or 4 straight wins and pulls off a playoff win, like what it could have looked like if he played the whole season, or even if it's truly dominant and all of a sudden it's a new team. Like, I wouldn't be shocked if he gets a vote or two, but at the end of the day, Jaden Daniels is absolutely the guy. Like, there's
put me down for in the shocked column if he gets a vote.
True.
Because there are other people who have, like, they're not backdooring into this award, right? Like,
right.
Jaden Daniels has been outstanding. Brock Bowers has been
certainly
like generationally good for tight ends. I mean, we're having a really, really good tight end season. We overvalue, for value purposes, quarterback play for good reason. I don't know that there's anything more that Brock Bowers could have done to have bested his odds of defeating Jaden Daniels, but Jaden Daniels being as good as he is at the quarterback position for a historically poor franchise, and all of a sudden overnight turning them into a contender, that has to be recognized. That game, however, against Philadelphia, I have mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand, Sam, I look at it and I want to almost have the conversations in 2 separate buckets. I want Washington Commanders fans to feel as happy as they are today, as optimistic as they do about their future. I want them to thump their chest. I want them to feel good about the win. I don't want to detract from any of that in any way. That said, I think if Jalen Hurts didn't get hurt, we're talking about a totally different outcome. And I don't think that there's any doubt in my mind that Jalen Hurts getting hurt totally changed the alchemy of that game in a ton of different reasons. Again, don't want to take away from Washington. I know that sentence does inherently, but I just don't think that there's any doubt that we're looking at a very, very different Philadelphia Eagles team for the rest of the game yesterday if Jalen Hurts is their quarterback.
Certainly. On the side, it kind of blends the two, but on the Commanders side, where it's like, let's be happy for the Commanders because this team is really good, I totally agree with that, and particularly on the defensive side of the ball. The Eagles' defense is a world beater, and they stuck with it all game despite having a ton of turnovers, and they still were moving the ball pretty well. Just imagine what would have happened without those turnovers. And I think that's the biggest excitement, given that this is an offensively led team in the Commanders. Now let's look at the Eagles. Coming into this week, I thought they were the least flawed team. 2 big flaws showed up in this game. The first is I was surprised by the reliance on Jalen Hurts' legs, because Kenny Pickett really didn't have a terrible outing in the passing game. He was plus EPA. He was kind of moving the ball in this game. Really, we're talking about it differently if Devontae Smith doesn't have a critical drop on a conversion. But not having Jalen's legs just changed the entire face of the game. All of a sudden, there were 9 guys in the box. The gap schemes that we've seen work time and time again with that offensive line and Saquon were absolutely shut down. Kellen Moore didn't seem to have an answer really of how to approach it without Jalen's ability to A, extend plays, and B, run on designed runs. And it changed the face of the game, just as you said. The second one, I think, is a much more minor issue, but it is on the defensive side of the ball. Chauncey Gardner-Johnson is a guy, as people had circled as the weakness of this defense to begin with, and he went out and it looked way worse. So maybe there's some safety issues there, particularly as you're going into the playoffs and you're going to have to face a team like the Lions who attack over the middle all the game. And that's basically how the Commanders ended up wrapping this game up, with a pass over the middle. I think that's the 2 flaws that really showed up. And I'm substantially more worried about if Jalen comes back from this concussion, maybe doesn't look the same, a little bit more hesitant to run. Does that really change the face of this offense even more, as we've talked about week over week this year about the passing game not being particularly there? Does that change how the Saquon game looks if Jalen isn't running as well?
Well, I mean, look, he still had a pretty good running game yesterday with Kenny Pickett in the backfield and without that threat to run. One of the things that I think is most interesting about the loss of Jalen Hurts is that they pivot to Kenny Pickett, who is so different.
Right.
So it changes the offense just on its face, in that you're not even asking Kenny Pickett to do the same things that you're asking Jalen Hurts to do. Like, everything's different on those late downs where you're looking to pick up, short yardage. Totally different, right? Like, you're not doing tush push, brotherly shove stuff with Kenny Pickett in the way that you would if you have a 4th down. The decision making is totally different, probably, with Pickett back there. What Jalen would have done on the ground, certainly only ran 3 times before he got hurt, but he had the highest rushing yards over expectation per attempt of the week on those runs. That, I assume, would have continued. The threat of him in the backfield with Saquon changes things for Saquon. And I mentioned Saquon obviously still had tons of success. He had tons of rushing attempts too, but his yards per attempt was still high. By the way, aside, Saquon MVP conversation, had a big game, didn't win the game. That's why we have value conversations.
Precisely.
Because it wasn't enough to get the dub. You need the strong quarterback play. But again, that's an aside. Kenny Pickett threw to 4 players. This, looking at the box score, I pulled it up last night and I was like, how is this an NFL box? They completed passes to only 3 players on the day, and AJ Brown and Devontae Smith caught all but 1 completed pass. That's insane that you're consolidating your offense. Like, you changed quarterbacks and now only 2 people are involved in the passing game from here on out. That's wild.
They've struggled with this all year. When AJ was out, the offense looked radically different. And they really struggle with that third wide receiver, third option problem because, like you mentioned, they're really only looking for Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown, period. The good thing is that's 2 top 15, top 20 wide receivers in the league that can really get it done at any given point in time. But especially as you move into the playoffs, I heard an interesting story the other day about how people always talk about the stars come out in the playoffs, and that's not the case, and how Bill Belichick would preach that to his lower bench guys. And he's like, Danny Amendola had a fantastic game for us. A backup running backs have had fantastic games for us. And I just don't know who that person could possibly be for this Eagles team, particularly if they get into a shootout with the Vikings or the Lions. And I think it's a major gap as well. And I think we're talking more and more about the Eagles, and we were talking about how flawless they were last week. And I'm glad we ran into a game like this because it really highlights some of these problems that they have.
I want to talk more about the defense, because the things that you said on the surface, obviously we all kind of saw it with our eyes, and okay, this exposed some weaknesses, and people are talking about, the thing that concerns me the most is what Washington was able to do to their defense. Okay, so looking at numbers here, Numbers don't always tell the story, which is why we're going to have a conversation after I tell you the numbers. The Eagles' defensive EPA per play was negative 0.16, which was the 5th number for a team on the week. Their EPA per pass was negative. Their EPA per rush was the 3rd best of the week, and they had the 8th best pressure rate. They tied for the 3rd most pressures. They got the pressure there very fast, 2.46. The one stat, just if we're looking for numbers that feel like problematic, is they did give up the most yards after contact per attempt of the week, which was a whopping 4.4 yards per attempt. That's huge. That feels like a Jaden Daniels stat to me, by the way. He had the highest rush EPA of the week. So just looking at those numbers, how do you, having watched the game, tell the story of those numbers?
I think there's a blend. And I think first, as you mentioned, and as I talked about at the top, it's a Jaden Daniels stat. Like Jaden Daniels just did what he had to do to win the game. And then I think this is a part where EPA gets really stuck on turnovers, because typically if you win the turnover battle, you win the game. And this was one of the rare cases where that doesn't really happen. They did limit the success rate of the Commanders throughout the game as well, so you can't really chalk it up to that as well. Where they lost this game was the late downs, and where they lost this game, or where they were beaten, frankly, was by Jaden Daniels. Jaden Daniels was able to make it happen on 3rd and 4th down throughout the game with both his arms and his legs. And when you have a player that catches fire like that in the late downs, which matters so much in these divisional matchups and will matter this much in the playoffs as well, you kind of got to give it up. Sometimes good offense beats good defense. And in this case, Jaden Daniels did that several times.
Yeah, I think more often than not, good offense beats good defense. But looking ahead to the postseason and just trying to figure out what to make of this, if this is the weakness, I'm trying to figure out which of the teams in the NFC are going to do that to you, aside from Washington. And honestly, right now, the Eagles are the 2 and Washington's the 7. And that might be the worst possible matchup.
I think you take solace in the fact that your offense, if Jalen Hurts is there, can probably beat this defense. But you really worry that your edge rushing that's in building right now cannot stop Jaden Daniels. And I don't really see a solution to that at this point. You can really try to win with your upfront pressure, but Jaden's been able to manage the pocket really well. And then once he gets outside, he causes tons and tons of problems. And he did in this game. And he's probably going to be cut loose even more in the playoffs. And so I think that's the thing you're working on the next couple of weeks is how can we improve our edge rushing? Is there new looks we can bring in to at least change the location of the pressure to stop him from breaking the pocket as much as he does? Are there things we can do with our blitz packages to improve that matchup? And it'll cross over to a certain degree to some of the other games, but you do highlight it well. Like, say they do end up in a matchup with the Vikings or the Lions down the stretch, and any of these teams, these are pretty standard drop back passing offenses.
They all are
really
in the
have
NFC.
to deal with it. Correct.
Aside from Washington. I mean, Green Bay, Minnesota, Atlanta, Tampa, LA, the Rams, Detroit.
Right.
If it's Seattle, I mean, there's no one else that's going to do what Jaden Daniels does. He is the guy outside of Jalen Hurts, right? Like the 2 teams from the NFC East are the ones they're going to potentially run on you from the quarterback position. So I think that's really interesting. They better hope that that's not the matchup.
Certainly. I mean, and you think about the way the Rams have operated all year. If they end up matched up with them, the Rams went on early downs. And what the Eagles do to you on defense is they force you to win on late downs. You're not going to beat Jalen Carter and Zach Bond and Cooper DeJean and Quinyon Mitchell on the early downs. It's just not going to happen. You're going to have to truly beat them at their own game. I don't know if the Rams can do that to a certain degree. I have substantially more trust in a team like the Lions or maybe even the Packers as well. But that you got to beat them where it's hard to beat them. And the Commanders certainly are probably positioned currently, just given their quarterback situation, to do that.
The Eagles loss obviously damages their ability to get to the 1 seed.
Mm-hmm.
The Lions and Vikings both now have a 1-game lead on them and the conference record tiebreaker. There's a path, obviously, but they don't have control over it. In terms of the Lions and Vikings, because the Lions have been sitting up there in the 1, for a while here pretty comfortably. Right. I think we've all pretty much assumed like the Lions have that on lock. Now you've got Minnesota sitting there at 13-2. What do you think are the chances that maybe they're going to play each other in week 18, Minnesota and Detroit? Minnesota has the Packers this week, which is certainly a tough matchup.
Right.
And Detroit has the Niners, which is looking less difficult, but I mean, that's certainly a game that you could lose, right?
Right. My money's still in Detroit. I think the path for the Vikings is continuing to play through their defense, continuing to play through Justin Jefferson. And we saw them in a tight game against Seattle. I'm almost positive it's going to be a tight game against the Packers. And then obviously you roll in week 18 against the Lions and try to get it done. I trust the Lions substantially more against this 49ers team, particularly given their ability to take the ball away, given the only 2 starters they have left are their safeties. And frankly, those are probably their 2 best players anyway, outside of Aiden Hutchinson. And I think the offense is going to steamroll that 49ers defense, frankly. Yeah. I just trust in the Lions at this point so much on the offensive side of the ball that it's difficult to believe that anyone can score with them to a certain degree. I mean, it was a pile driving effort against the Bears. They were it looked like the Lions, pre-injuries, where they were taking great appreciation in torturing the Bears defense and doing it in a myriad of ways that we probably wouldn't have seen otherwise.
I mean, they lost David Montgomery, heard all the questions all week long about attrition, and they answered with a 475-yard offensive outing, the most of the week, the highest EPA per play of the week, in a win where they doubled up a division rival. That's obviously going through it, and we have to acknowledge that. Chicago's defense has been a strength of the team, at least, was earlier in the season, prior to Eberflus walking out the door, I suppose. I don't know. But yeah, I think the Lions are fascinating because of the sky is falling that we saw last week. And then they come out and they beat a team by roughly the amount of points that they probably should have beaten them. And I think that that's the most interesting thing about them, is that they never play down to the level of competition. They never have just like off weeks where it feels like, oh yeah, we just didn't get up for that one. Like they're such an interesting team.
It's an interesting place to be in because I'm at the point where I don't know if they're the most talented team in the NFC
because of the injuries.
Because of the injuries, but they're certainly the most trustworthy team.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of comes down to coaching at this point. And it's always very difficult to quantify coaching or even identify coaching outside of timeouts and play calling and stuff like that. But for whatever reason, Dan Campbell and Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn have this team on an absolute rampage in a way that the Eagles just have not been all year. The Eagles have been very controversial. Even when they're winning games big, they're fighting with one another. Jalen goes down in this game. They're not able to kind of pick it back up, and the whole offensive attack kind of changes. It doesn't feel like that would be the case. Frankly, hasn't been the case with the Lions. And I think if you're going to give someone a check mark where you're like, this is probably a 1B talented team, but they're a 1A true performance team, I think this is the way to label it for the Lions.
Yeah. Is Dan Campbell your coach of the year?
Yeah. I mean, they're going to win 14 games with no players on defense. It's crazy. It's mind-blowing to me.
I mean, there's obviously a Minnesota argument
certainly
to be made as well. I just think I think Dan Campbell gets the benefit of all of the years prior to this also in my vote. Like he built this, he laid that groundwork. He set, the whole culture building thing. It took us to this moment. And I kind of feel like, in those years where you're like, yeah, somebody else did more. Somebody else did. Like, I think this is the year that he gets almost credit for the entire thing. Because this is clearly, I mean, there's a lot there's a lot going on there. Both of the coordinators are outstanding. They've done a great job about building the roster. The front office gets credit. Like, everybody gets credit. There's credit to go around. Dan Campbell feels like the linchpin for all of it. And so for me, it's an easy decision, but I love Kevin O'Connell and what he's done. And that would be my number 2. Yeah. So the Lions obviously are interesting. Both of those teams are, honestly. I kind of can't believe that the Vikings are right there with them, to be honest, because I can believe that the Lions are still here, which is wild, but we've trained ourselves to expect that they can almost handle whatever curveballs come at them. It almost feels like the Patrick Mahomes with the high ankle sprain, that he's almost going to be better in the week to follow if you've been paying attention. Now I kind of feel like Lions, you're like, yeah, I know that they should be worse next week because we're playing guys that are so deep on the depth chart prior to the season, but I don't think they're going to be worse. So our expectation doesn't, like, the goal line doesn't move, I think, for our conversations with them. The Bills on the AFC side, that game was a little scary for Buffalo Bills fans going up against New England, which, by the way, we talked about, or there is talk about the teams who are trying to tank for better draft position. And I think that the Patriots are certainly in the conversation of teams that should want to lose because of draft pick. They did it in the best possible way yesterday. That was the best possible case scenario where they got to feel good about themselves. They certainly gave their best effort. They took the Buffalo Bills and really pushed them to the limit, and then they still lost.
Right.
It was like best of both worlds type of situation. But Josh Allen had a bad game. Playing with what we're hearing is now a broken left hand that he's been playing with all season. Now has an issue with his throwing hand, which he stopped being able to feel. What do you make of what you saw from the Bills yesterday and your level of concern about them moving forward?
I think it's funny because you're going up against a team that is doing one of the most blatant tank jobs. So insofar that the coach is saying he's not designing runs for Drake May, which is hilarious because Drake May, if you are throwing that in, becomes like a supernova like we see Josh Allen. It seems like excellent game from him. I'm still just really worried about that defense. It looked like Drake May could do what he wanted pretty much the whole game. Yeah. He finishes, in the 61st percentile EPA for the game. He was making fantastic throws everywhere, but there were throws available all night. And if Josh Allen is going to be injured, he's kind of been the one who's carried the load all year. I've highlighted it. This is not a super talented team outside of the offensive line, the running back room, and the quarterbacks. The edge rushers have played very well and are very talented, but that's really the spot for them on the defense. And everyone else kind of has been coming along or been injured this year. This is not a team that is built to be a competitor, but Josh Allen has made them a competitor almost by sheer force of will. And that's what happens when you get into a game with a young, hot quarterback who is playing very well and whose team wants to compete, is you really start to struggle and your flaws kind of pop up. And if Josh Allen's going to be injured and that defense is not going to play well, it's going to be very difficult for them to win moving forward.
To your point about Josh Allen, I made the mistake of putting his name into the search bar on Twitter looking for hand injury updates this morning. And in general, I think it's not a good idea to read anything on Twitter like that is outside your curated feed because the tone has just become so insanely negative. But Josh Allen was just lit up. And I was not as aware as maybe I should have been that so many people have the hate that they have for Josh Allen and or think that the discussion about him in the media is driven by the media. Like, it was wild, the number of comments there that made it seem like every conversation that's been had about Josh Allen has just been people glazing him. Like and this isn't even worth a conversation, but I just found it interesting on two fronts. One, I've been spending more time on Blue Sky where that's not the dynamic, and it reminded me that I should stay there in some ways. But also, I just think it's so interesting that people see him, that Josh Allen, of all people, with the clear and obvious ways that he impacts the Bills, that people would possibly look at him and think that he was like a made up figure, that people had just decided that they liked him and that they were going to prop him up somehow. Like there's just no evidence to that in any way. And so again, I'm sure that anybody who's listening to this podcast, I'm probably preaching to all of the choirs right now, but I just thought that that was wild, that there's even a cross section of people out there that see him that way.
Yeah, me and Tage and Sean have the infinite engagement machine, which obviously this is a divisive issue because sometimes we'll just text each other while watching the Bills games, just the name Josh Allen. So insofar that now it's my sister's favorite player. Also because of the celebrity relationship as well. But if we turn on Josh Allen, she just is in my ear talking about Josh Allen. We were out with a couple friends who's a big Bills fan, and they talked about Josh Allen forever. So maybe it's kind of the Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce. He's in the bigger media now.
Yeah.
So we're going to be
sick
anti.
of hearing about it.
Exactly. We were there first. But it is funny because people were so upset that people weren't listing his interception, for example. That was a major point of issue.
Oh, this is an arm punt when he does it, but when our guy does it, it's a pick. Yeah.
But how many times do we see Tom Brady do that exact thing over the course of his career, where it's like third down, 50-yard line, third and long, like let's just get it deep and see what happens. Like this is just something that quarterbacks like that like to do. And so I'm definitely, a Josh Allen fan. I love watching him go out there and run around and throw some lances to some wide receivers. But I can see why, the tide may be turning, particularly the last couple weeks. He took a loss and the whole takeaway was Josh Allen's so good. And I'm like, well, you lost the game and Matthew Stafford kind of played better than you, even though y'all both played very well. And so I can maybe not understand the vitriol, but there is definitely a narrative where people love watching Josh Allen play because he's just so fun to watch play. I mean, there's no getting around that.
Well, and aside from him even being fun, like what you talked about with his pass catchers, there are so many ways that he's propped up this team that if you took Josh Allen, do you really think if you took Josh Allen off of this roster that the Buffalo Bills are a contender? And replace them with average quarterback. Like who's a good name that we can even use that makes this conversation so it's like, no, I'm not replacing him with like the dregs of the quarterback pool, right?
Right. For example, if you go to rookie Bo Nix, who's played well and people are excited about him, if you put Bo Nix on this team and it's not going well, period. You're not throwing to even Cortland Sutton, who's an above average wide receiver to a certain degree. You're not even throwing to Cortland Sutherland, for example. And the offensive play calling has been good and the running backs have been good as well. But nonetheless, like it ain't looking good no matter who you select out of the pot that's not named Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson or someone of that ilk.
One of the specific issues that yesterday was on his deep ball. He was 0 for 6 on deep balls, and he was 1 for 9 on throws of 15 yards or more. I looked into his deep ball stats this year. He's attempted the second most deep balls, trails Caleb by 1. He has 69 attempts. Make your jokes. Do you know how many of those have resulted in a touchdown on the actual throw?
I don't know.
69 deep ball attempts, 20 yards or more, zero touchdowns on those. That feels like almost hard to do, statistically speaking. Like you would think that one of those would, lead to a broken coverage or he'd get behind the defender and it would result in a touchdown. 0. His completion percentage on those throws, again, 69 attempts, 34%. That's the 28th highest completion percentage on those throws. This feels like something that maybe, and as I was watching his passing chart yesterday, around halftime, early third quarter, I noticed that we're just missing on all the deep balls. And so, that's obviously a lower percentage throw and that's going to happen. And maybe like you keep that up and then you hit a couple of them and that's the difference in the game. Or the ADOT at that point was like 11.2. I was like, maybe the ADOT comes down. Maybe something's not working downfield. Maybe there's something that's not working with him, with the physicality, whatever. And you bring the ADOT down and you lead to, just take some plays that have a higher success rate, and then you have a higher success rate as an offense. And it just feels wild to me that these numbers are what they are and that they haven't necessarily adjusted. Like there's something in the offense that's missing when it comes to that.
Just as you're talking about this, and I'd have to do deeper research onto if this is the actual case, but I wonder if this is not an approach where maybe this is kind of a wide receiver stat as well. If you're not getting the separation, Keon Coleman's never been known as a
No.
separator. He's been a jump ball guy, which is great when you're playing for Florida State, but a lot more difficult when you're in the NFL. Khalil Shakir has been good, down the field, but maybe this is a point in case where not having Stephon Diggs hurts. Not having even a Tyreek Hill type character or someone to really throw deep down the field to really causes problems. Now, you got to go through the stats. You got to watch the film. You got to break down the tracking data for all that. But at the end of the day, like, it's a two-way street. The offensive line has been doing their job to a certain degree. So it comes down to Josh Allen being accurate, which for the most part, he's played very well this year. And it comes down to the wide receivers doing their job, getting separation, being able to win at the catch point. I wonder if that's not a part of this as well.
So one of the big questions about Josh Allen coming off of that game is whether or not it should cost Josh Allen the MVP award. He was the leader in the clubhouse going into the game. I think it probably does swing back to Lamar. And the reason has to do with why it swung away from Lamar in the first place, and that was bad games at bad times, specifically down the stretch. That's obviously what Josh Allen had yesterday. So let's go back to the drawing board and evaluate the two of them head to head. Looking at the numbers, and who has the edge in different categories. Passing touchdowns, Lamar. Interceptions, Lamar. Passing yards, Lamar. Yards per attempt, Lamar. Completion percentage over expectation, Lamar, with a greater air yards number. Rushing yards, Lamar. Rushing yards per carry, Lamar. He also has twice as many runs of 10 yards or more. Interestingly, the stats that swing Josh's way, rush EPA, Lamar's is negative. Josh's is the best in the league, plus 57. Josh has not fumbled. Lamar has lost 4 fumbles. So Josh, when you put them together, interceptions and fumbles, has fewer turnovers than Lamar. He has more rushing touchdowns. And when you add in the rushing touchdowns, then the gap, the total touchdown gap closes, but Lamar still has the edge there. Pressure to sack rate, edge Josh. I feel like just looking at like kind of advanced stats and some volume stats, there's a lot of evidence there that kind of pushes towards Lamar. Those are just the numbers. What else do we need to take into consideration?
I think when you think about the most valuable player, you have to break it down and try as hard as possible to take away the external elements and understand the true value that player is doing. And I think Lamar just has a really good team this year. I mean, Derrick Henry is an absolute beast, has just finished games in the Steelers game, frankly, finished the Steelers off down the stretch. And even, Lamar threw a very costly pick that had me on like my hands and knees, like hands on my head, like, oh no, I thought this was the ball game. Costly pick there. The offensive line, which was supposed to be a true weakness and would have been, early season, if you had to tell me Lamar was going to be in MVP conversations yet again, I was going to be probably the offensive line is bad and he's making it happen all by himself in play creation. That's not been the case. The offensive line has been a 75th percentile, top quarter offensive line in the league. They've had rookies come along. They've had Ronnie Stanley play really well again. Linderbaum also playing very well. Like, they have good people. The pass catching room really has not been bad. Typically that's also been an issue. Zay Flowers has been very, very good this year, at least an 80th percentile wide receiver. We had him on our midseason all-pro list. Fantastic year to start the year. Tailed off a little bit from then on. And then Mark Andrews has come back into the fray, particularly in the red zone. Like, he has a lot of good players around him.
Yeah.
On the Bills offense, who are you really confident in? James Cook and Deion Dawkins? Is that maybe not even James Cook? He's had 2 big runs in the past 2 weeks, but is it just Deion Dawkins who you're really like, this is a certified guy? I can name 6 guys on the Ravens offense that are absolutely certified guys. And so I think it just comes down to it. Josh Allen is more valuable to his team than Lamar is per se. I think they could get away with going with a Titan style offense and still winning a couple games. Should he go down? If Josh Allen goes down, this team is bad, like BAD bad, in my opinion, just this year, of course.
It's such an interesting conversation because it feels a little bit weird to take credit away from someone who's playing as well as they could possibly play because the players around him are good. Like because he is in an environment where the front office has done an incredible job and
Certainly.
where the coaches do a good job and pretty consistently have done that. But I guess then that becomes like a eye of the beholder type situation and how they define for themselves value, and like whether or not being good on a roster that otherwise is not good is something that you want to take into consideration, how much you're elevating the people around you. Because there's, I guess that's kind of a harder thing to quantify, though to a degree, looking at the Ravens roster, like the things that you're saying there are sort of obviously true. Like it's objectively true that there are a lot of really good players around him.
Right. And again, we're really splitting hairs here. Like you look at,
but you kind of have to.
grades.
You're talking
Certainly.
about two very, very good candidates for MVP and how you decide it.
Exactly. Like if you're looking at adjusted EPA per play, I mean, you noted it. You look at almost any statistic, period, and it's number one, Josh Allen or Lamar, and number two, Josh Allen or Lamar. And maybe you throw a Burrow or a Daniels or a Jared Goff in there from time to time, depending on what you're looking at. But like these two dudes are operating at levels, frankly, we probably haven't even seen since, the Breeze and the Brady and the Manning days. Like these guys are certified electric players that you build the house out of. And it's really fun to watch them play. I just think this year, Josh Allen probably finally gets the nod.
You know what's funny? How I mentioned about Lamar's, like the rush EPA stuff and how Josh has like a massive edge in that department this year. Right. And then in terms of, I talked about Josh's deep ball numbers. Lamar's are, wait, is that possible that he has the same exact amount? No, he has 62 attempts and 24 completions. They have the same number of deep ball completions on the season and roughly the same. Anyway, his numbers are slightly better in terms of completion percentage. And then he has 8 touchdowns on those. My point being, like, if you were to look at the narratives about them when they entered the league and you're like, Josh's arm, right? And then Lamar's legs. And then there's Lamar over here doing it, largely in the pocket and completing these deep balls and making these big plays that way with a negative rush EPA. And then it's almost like the opposite is true for Josh Allen.
Certainly. I'm really interested. Who's the best? Let me guess. My guess would be Jared Goff this year because that's a real basis, or Sam Darnold.
Yeah.
Is that the best?
Well, Sam Darnold's up there.
Okay.
So how do you want to define best? Completion percentage?
Yeah, just for the statistic, sure.
Russell Wilson.
That checks out. I mean, it really does. Their whole offense is based around that.
55.6% is his deep ball completion rate.
And it seems like he should have a lot of attempts as well, right?
He is. It's way down. Well, I mean, he's played in fewer games. Like a lot fewer.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So it's harder I don't have the per game average. Right. I don't have the ability to parse that out. So he has 36 attempts. You figure that probably is roughly the same, right? Because he's played in probably like half the games roughly.
Right.
So he has 36 attempts, 20 completions, 5 touchdowns, 1 interception. And this is wild. His turnover worthy play rate is 0. So the interception deemed not his fault, which is a conversation that I think we also need to have about how we track interceptions. And that's Russell Wilson. But that also goes to the point about when we were talking about Josh Allen and the types of guys that he has to throw it to downfield. Whereas Russell Wilson's throwing to, and I don't want to take credit away from Russell Wilson. Certainly he deserves credit, but just in terms of the fact that he's throwing it to George Pickens. And we've seen with our
Exactly.
eyes him go up and grab it, right? And so he's winning those balls. Whereas does Josh Allen have that guy that can go win those balls or get behind the defense and create that separation? And I think that's an interesting point. Sam Darnold is second in those deep balls, but has a turnover worthy play rate on those balls of 11%. So Russell Wilson.
Well, it really makes sense because I'm also thinking about the balls that we see Josh go deep on, including the quote arm punt, the controversial arm punt. And typically it's when he breaks the pocket and is making something happen and someone gets open downfield. And in that case, it's less of a timing route, which Russell Wilson is certainly throwing to guys like George Pickens. And we saw him complete a couple to Calvin Austin in the past game as well. But it's more of figure it out, backyard football. And I think there's probably a much wider margin for error there, particularly because you're probably throwing to guys that are not on the same page as you. And also you're controlling for, I want this to go out of bounds. Like it doesn't hurt me if this goes out of bounds or something or drops incomplete as compared to a 9 route where you're dropping 3 steps back and letting it fly. But it is, I think it fits into the narrative really well because even looking at Sam Darnold, who are those deep balls going to? They're going to Jordan Addison and Justin Jefferson. Like it's a big gap there, particularly in those deep ball numbers.
How do we account for interceptions that are not the quarterback's fault? Like we got to come up. We have so many advanced stats now. I mean, for crying out loud, there's a stat called Eckle rate that no one can even figure out or knows what it means. Like at the very least, we have adjusted completion percentage. Like, why is there not a stat that's specifically interceptions that were the quarterback's fault versus interceptions that were not? Clearly, and I'm be the first to raise my hand that branding's not good.
Right. I think it's hard. I think there's the obvious versions of this, like the Michael Penix throw we were talking about, where he completed the pass and the ball did not end up completed for one reason or another. And that was definitely not his fault. I think that the harder ones are like we were talking about Josh Allen last year, where it seemed as if he had a ton of picks, but the picks didn't seem to hurt him. This has been a narrative with Matthew Stafford as well through the years. I think the way that we try to do it at SumerSports to a certain degree is rather than understanding why this ball got picked off or not, because that's not really what we're trying to identify, I don't think, Lindsay. I think what we're trying to identify is how good of a decision maker is this guy. And the way that we do it is using the tracking data, try to identify who the optimal production receiver is at any given point in time in a play. And so you look at a guy like Josh Allen, he's a pretty good decision maker this year. He's in the better half of the league. He's a top 15 guy. You look at the big throw rate too, in terms of saying, oh, well, he didn't really, complete any of these deep passes. Well, what is a big throw? It's difficult to achieve. It's down the field. It ends in an explosive play. He's, 6th in the league in that statistic this year. So there are ways to kind of take away what you quote want, the traits that you want to identify while getting rid of some of the noise. But it is really hard to figure out if you're just saying, an interception's an interception and picks hurt. It is hard to identify, whose issue it is at any given point in time.
Well, maybe it doesn't affect like what we're trying to do here at Sumer in terms of information that's being given to the teams and to try and help their decision making with rosters and stuff like that. Maybe in that sense, it doesn't matter, but I think that's fixing that stat in some way or offering an alternative does matter in terms of the conversations that are had more in mass, like that reach broader audiences. Because last year, Josh Allen's a perfect example of this. Everybody talked about the turnovers last year. And so if the entire knock against him as a quarterback is look at how many interceptions he has, and then you turn around the year after that and he throws almost none, and then people yell at you because you're glazing him about that, whatever. My point,
I like the usage of the term glazing. This is
that
a
one.
New one.
That one hit.
I typically try to stay away from that one.
Yeah. Well, I probably should as well. That's a good point. Anyway, my point is, I think you do need to kind of alter some of these, we come up with some of these advanced stats to influence the way that we're looking at things.
Right.
And I think some of them have to reach broad audiences, and some of them we hope do and become more part of the lexicon. Clearly, when I'm over here dropping like EPA CPOE composite score, when I go on radio stations, I realize that might not reach the largest audience of people that's listening without an explanation. But I feel like there's got to be a way that we can do that with interceptions, just so people aren't looking at people and throwing up stats that actually are in fact meaningless. I don't know.
Right.
But going back to your decision making metric that Sumer has, do you have any of that information in front of you? Is there a way, like, who are some of the better decision makers
Yeah.
by Sumer
So,
metrics?
like I said, Josh Allen is really good, and we know that Josh Allen is a big game hunter. And so it helps that he's also pretty good at identifying, who the big game is at any moment in time. I think typically when it comes to decision making, as I'm trying to pull it up here, the guys that we typically see do better are also aided by scheme a lot. So like number one, almost always in this has been Tua Tagovailoa, but that's because number one, he has Tyreek Hill and he has Waddle, and then also now Devon Achane has become an excellent receiving option as well. They're getting really open, and he automatically is hitting them. You see some other guys, non-shockingly, number two in this with volume is Lamar Jackson. Like he's doing what it needs to be. The most interesting case of this, though, that I've found is these young quarterbacks that are typically ID'd as film guys. So the Anthony Richardsons of the world, the Drake Mays of the world, are also very high on this. Anthony Richardson's issue, if you were to ask SumerSports, has been his accuracy. He's targeting the receivers that need to be targeted in the Shane Steichen offense. He's just not getting it there. And in our head, the recommendation would be, okay, let's get him some coaching. Let's get him more starts. Let's develop him as a passer in terms of the ability to be accurate. But we've seen guys like Drake May just immediately have that level of accuracy. Some other good guys on this list, Brock Purdy, Russell Wilson, and then some interesting guys like Jameis Winston, another big game hunter, excellent decision maker because he's going after the big plays that need to be there. But we've seen him overthrow guys. We've seen interceptions because he's spraying it all around. So it is an interesting dichotomy. Sam Darnold also up there with Josh Allen. But when you're starting to build the narrative off the statistic like that, is these are the guys who identify how can I get an explosive play, and they're going to get you in an opportunity to execute that. It's just a matter of can they execute it. I think it's a little bit more. So like let's look at guys in the more in the 30s. Unsurprisingly, Gardner Minshew. We've talked for years about his ability to really get the ball down the field. You look at other guys. Baker actually is pretty low here, but Baker does take a lot of checkdowns from time to time, particularly given that he has good receiving wide receivers. Rashad White doesn't have a ton of downfield talent other than Mike Evans. Other guys, Mason Rudolph, Kyler Murray, Dak Prescott, CJ Stroud hasn't been particularly good at this. Neither has Jalen Hurts this year. Now we're getting a little bit more into the median, but it's interesting to note that that's the dichotomy there with that decision-making metric.
And so looking for explosive plays would be weighted over somebody who's just maybe looking to stay ahead of the sticks. And
in this exact case, yes, particularly given that we have an idea of, again, we're predicting the actual production on the play. So we are controlling for how hard is this pass to complete. So correct.
You might have already said his name. Where does Patrick Mahomes rank in this year? Or like what range are we looking at there?
So this year he's right around the middle, right around the median. Yeah. So he's like 20, which makes sense, I think, for this year.
It does, but also makes you think about the entire project, right? To a degree, because then are you saying that he is a middle of the road decision maker? Or I have a hard time wrapping my brain around that.
It'd be basically saying, in terms with the decision making, that he is more willing to take a less explosive play at any given point in time. And I think when you have the confidence The reason why people love explosive plays is because it's very hard to be successful on a play-to-play basis in the NFL. And I think unless you are Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, exactly. Like, so it's a great example that you bring up, Lindsay, because, I don't really have confidence that offensive line that is in front of CJ Stroud is going to be great for 3 straight downs at any given point in time. You know who I do have confidence is going to be great for 3 straight downs? The Kansas City Chiefs offensive line and the Kansas City Chiefs running backs. Yep. So, it's a different mix, and he's also facing some different coverages. The looks are different and stuff like that. And a guy like Jameis Winston, you want to push down the field because he's inaccurate. A guy like Patrick Mahomes, you absolutely, under any circumstances, do not want to make him push it down the field because he's going to murder you. So there's a lot of stuff at play, but it is explainable when it comes down to items like that.
Love it, Sam. All right, so we have a couple of games coming up in a couple of days on Christmas, just a couple of days away. We're doing this show a day early. Normally tape on Tuesdays, but we're going to go ahead and take that day off to enjoy, well, as much as we do in this space, because there's always football news that needs to be accounted for. But hope that all of you listening have a wonderful holiday. And goodness knows we're going to have lots to talk about next week after week 17. And I mean, are we going to have is it possible we have 7 teams on each side and that just is who it is? And we're only talking about playoff seeding?
It's very possible. Funny coming from last year where it was the Wild Wild West, but these teams have really kind of locked it in. Sad because I really want to see the Bengals in the playoffs, but that's just somehow how the way it breaks.
That would be fun. That is wild that they were 4-8. Now we're looking at 7-8, and they're still here.
They've been a good team all year. It's just their defense sucked.
They've been a good offense all year.
That's a good point.
And then when they play Cleveland, the defense is fine too. I noticed that they were popping. I mentioned the Falcons stats that I was looking at defensively, and the Bengals kept popping up. And in yards after contact, they were more middle of the pack because I always look for them now because they've just been so terrible at tackling. And I was like, it's Cleveland. It's a Cleveland bump. But it looks like on the AFC side, it's entirely possible that we're looking at 7 teams because you've got Indy, Miami, and Cincy who are all 7-8 and couldn't drop out this week because they're two games back of just about everybody that's in. So that's a possibility. Not sure if that's true on the NFC side where we've got Tampa tied with Atlanta and then Seattle 1 game back of Los Angeles. So we might have to track the NFC race for another week, but either way, we'll have seeding races to keep our eye on and lots of fun stuff as we head down this stretch. Have a happy holiday for everybody out there. Go check out the Sumer Daily Pod with Sam on a daily basis. Are you putting one up every day this week, or is there an alteration to that schedule also?
Putting one up every day this week. We got we got a little review of college, and my dad's joining me again for the holidays. He has some hot takes on Jared Goff, which I was listening to in depth and was reviewing.
What?
He's a big Jared Goff guy. He's locked in. He's very pro Jared Goff. I wouldn't be shocked if he comes on the pod and makes a case that he's like the MVP this year. It's South Louisiana, baby. We keep it hot. And then we're breaking down the Saints game. We got a Saints game today. We're recording on Monday, just for the record, everyone. So we're watching the Saints game. We're going to break it down. We're going to go through, some potential coaching options. He's doing research right now. So we'll see what he has to say, but it'll be a good one.
Awesome. Lots to look forward to there. Be sure to check it out wherever you get your podcasts and check out the SumerSports website, SumerSports.com, with all of the free advanced stats that we're talking about here on the show. Have a happy holidays. We'll see you next week.